I'm sorry.
The rain was relentless, hammering against the narrow street like a warning I had been too blind to hear. My hand hovered over the polished wood of the stranger's door, trembling because I already knew something was wrong, something my wife had been hiding for weeks. The moment I knocked, her face went pale, her knees nearly buckled, and for the first time, I saw fear, raw and unmistakable, reflected in her eyes. I had thought I knew everything about the woman I loved, but tonight, every certainty shattered. A secret had been kept, a betrayal simmering in the shadows, and I was standing right at the threshold of it. The world I built around trust, love, and loyalty was about to crumble, and there was no turning back. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, comment your current city and local time below, and don't forget to subscribe to follow every twist and revelation with me. The days leading up to that rainy evening had been a storm of their own, though I had been too caught in the mundane rhythms of life to notice. My wife, Leela, had been acting strangely small, almost imperceptible signs that, in hindsight, screamed of secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. She would disappear for hours, claiming errands or work obligations that didn't add up, returning with a faint tension in her posture, a careful avoidance of my gaze. There were moments when I thought I caught a flicker of guilt in her eyes, but it always vanished the instant I met her stare. Those fleeting shadows now seemed like a prelude to the revelation I would confront that night. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just stress, or perhaps I was overreacting, influenced by too many crime stories, too many tales of betrayal whispered in the undercurrent of life. But a gut feeling had begun to gnaw at me, persistent, insistent. It wasn't just a suspicion, it was a sense of impending doom, a warning that something fundamental had shifted in the life we had meticulously built together. Every laugh shared, every quiet evening on the sofa, now felt tinged with the possibility of deception. In the evenings, I began noticing patterns. Her phone would light up at odd hours, messages disappearing too quickly for me to see. There were silences that stretched longer than necessary, as though she was holding back an invisible truth. And then there were the subtle behavioral quirks, the way her fingers would tremble slightly when she thought I wasn't looking, or how her smile sometimes faltered, her eyes darting somewhere beyond me. I knew my love for her was unwavering, but my intuition screamed that love alone wouldn't carry me through what was coming. I tried talking to her, gently probing with questions cloaked in casual conversation. Did anything happen at work today? Did you meet anyone interesting? But her answers were always smooth, polished, a practiced veneer of normalcy. And yet, in the smallest moments, the briefest pauses, the fleeting hesitation, before she answered, I could see the cracks forming. It was in these fragments that my anxiety grew, building a quiet storm that matched the one gathering outside the night I approached the door. It wasn't only her behavior that unsettled me. Friends had begun to notice a shift in her energy too. During our rare social gatherings, she would drift, laughing less readily, her attention diverted elsewhere. I chalked it up to stress or distraction, yet even I could not ignore the subtle distance creeping into our interactions. And I, desperate for reassurance, clung to the familiar routine of our evenings together, pretending that nothing was amiss, even as the shadows grew. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through my messages, looking for anything I might have missed, anything that could explain the sudden tension suffusing our home. And there it was, a brief notification, deleted almost instantly, from an unknown number. The words flashed too quickly to read, but the feeling it left behind was unmistakable. Someone knew something I didn't, and it involved her. The realization hit me like cold water. I had been living alongside a secret, oblivious, and now the veil was beginning to lift. The following morning, I attempted to confront her indirectly, testing the waters. I asked innocuous questions about her day, her interactions, trying to catch a hint, a slip, anything that could confirm the gnawing suspicion. But she remained flawless, a mask of composure and warmth that belied the storm I could sense beneath. The tension in my chest was suffocating. I loved her more than I had ever admitted to myself, but the uncertainty, the gnawing feeling that my life had been a carefully orchestrated illusion, was unbearable. I could no longer remain passive, so I started observing, discreetly, methodically. I noted the times she left the house, the places she visited, the way her eyes would flick toward the screen of her phone, as though measuring the consequences of a single glance. Every detail became a piece of the puzzle, every hesitation a clue. I felt like a detective unraveling a crime scene, except the victim was my own heart, and the perpetrator was someone I loved deeply. The irony was cruel and inescapable. As the days passed, I began preparing mentally for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. I imagined the scenarios, the anger, the pleading, the denials, the explanations that might or might not come. My mind oscillated between hope and dread, a pendulum swinging with relentless force. I reminded myself that understanding the truth, no matter how painful, was necessary. Living in uncertainty, in half-truths and hidden motives, was a slow poison, eroding the foundation of our relationship. And then came the day when the suspense became unbearable. A series of coincidences, subtle yet undeniable, led me to the door I would knock on that fateful evening. I remember standing there, hand raised, heart racing, the sound of the rain against the roof, the distant hum of city traffic, and the creaking of the old wooden door beneath my knuckles formed a symphony of tension that seemed to stretch time itself. And then I saw her, Lila. Her legs almost gave out, her face drained of color, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and guilt. The sight etched itself into my memory, a frozen moment of revelation and anticipation. At that instant, I understood something profound. The life I thought I had known was about to change irrevocably. The secret she had carried, the hidden truth that had eluded me for weeks, was within reach, just beyond the threshold. And I, though consumed by a whirlwind of fear and curiosity, knew I had to face it. There was no turning back. What lay behind that door would redefine everything I thought I understood about love, trust, and betrayal. The moment before the door opened, I felt the weight of countless unspoken words, of suspicions that had grown into certainty, pressing down on my chest. My pulse thundered in my ears, each beat a countdown to the revelation I had been both dreading and craving. And in that moment, as I drew a shaky breath and prepared to cross the line into the unknown, I realized that this was not just about uncovering a secret. It was about confronting the fragility of human relationships, the power of truth, and the endurance of a heart that refused to be deceived. No story of betrayal is ever simple, and no confrontation is without consequence. The events that followed, the confessions and confrontations, the emotions laid bare in ways words can barely capture, would test me, challenge the boundaries of trust, and force both of us to face the raw, unfiltered reality of our choices. But for now, as the door waited, rain still pelting the streets, and Lila trembling beside me, all that mattered was what lay ahead, an uncharted, emotionally charged journey into the heart of deception and the fragile hope of redemption. The day after that night, I woke with a sense of urgency gnawing at me, as though the world itself had shifted and demanded my immediate attention. Lila moved quietly around the house, her usual energy muted, replaced with an almost imperceptible tension that clung to her movements. Every glance she cast in my direction felt like a test, a fleeting measure of my suspicion, and I felt the weight of the secret pressing between us, invisible yet suffocating. I tried to focus on routine, to convince myself that life could maintain its fragile balance, but the phone call that arrived mid-morning shattered that illusion. The number was unfamiliar, the voice distorted, yet the words carried a cold precision that sent a chill down my spine. "You don't know the whole story," the caller said, voice low, almost a whisper, "but you're about to find out." Before I could respond, the line went dead. My hands shook as I held the phone, the message lingering in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't yet ignited. It was the confirmation I didn't want, yet the one I had subconsciously anticipated. Someone, somewhere, knew. The careful veil Leela had maintained, the carefully orchestrated facade of normalcy, had begun to unravel, and though I loved her, a fierce storm of fear and suspicion rose within me. How much had she hidden? How long had she been living a dual life, allowing me to exist in blissful ignorance, while secrets festered just beneath the surface? I spent the next hours retracing every interaction, every text message, every fleeting expression that I had once dismissed as inconsequential. The fragments began to coalesce, forming patterns I could no longer ignore. There was the way she had avoided eye contact on Thursday evening, the hastened steps when returning from her so-called errands, the subtle tension in her voice when answering innocuous questions. Each detail now seemed like a coded message, a breadcrumb trail leading toward a revelation I was both terrified and compelled to uncover. My thoughts raced, colliding in a storm of scenarios. Had she been meeting someone? Was there a betrayal I hadn't seen coming? A plan executed with meticulous precision to shield her secret? I grappled with the idea that my marriage, the foundation of my life, could be built on a lie. My chest tightened, each heartbeat echoing the tension that pulsed through my veins. Even in the quietest moments, I could feel the invisible thread of deceit pulling taut, threatening to snap. Unable to remain passive, I decided to follow her that evening. It was not a choice made lightly. I knew the risk, the potential damage to the trust we had left. Yet the need for answers overpowered the hesitation. I parked a few streets away, the city lights casting long, distorted shadows across the wet asphalt, rain glistening like shards of glass. Lila emerged from the house, an umbrella shielding her from the drizzle, and I followed at a careful distance. My mind a whirlwind of suspicion and dread, the streets blurred past as I kept my distance, noting the way her movements seemed purposeful yet clandestine. Every turn she took, every pause, I catalogued mentally, mapping the invisible path of her secret life. It led her into a nondescript building, one I had never noticed before, tucked between a convenience store and a laundromat. The door closed behind her with a muted click, and for a moment I stood frozen on the sidewalk. Grappling with a mix of anticipation and fear, I knew then that I had to find a way inside to witness whatever truth lay hidden beyond that door. But the thought of confronting her, of forcing a revelation before I was ready, terrified me just as much as the possibility of discovering betrayal. Still, the urgency was undeniable. I needed to know. Every instinct screamed at me that the life I had known was on the precipice of change, and stepping back now would only allow the secret to grow, fester, and consume everything I cherished. I returned home that night, pretending normalcy, but the tension was unbearable. Lila's presence felt different, distant, charged with an unspoken fear. She avoided my gaze, her words clipped, measured, as though she were guarding something I was not meant to see. I studied her, trying to read her expressions, to decode the subtle shifts in her demeanor. It was a psychological dance, each of us aware of the invisible stakes, each step laden with meaning that neither of us spoke aloud. Sleep eluded me. I lay awake, imagining every scenario that could unfold, from confrontation to confession, from betrayal to explanation. The mind is a dangerous thing in moments like these. It twists the smallest details into monumental evidence, connects innocuous events into a narrative of deception. Yet, beneath the anxiety, a thread of determination wove itself through my thoughts. I would uncover the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how it might fracture the world I had built. The following day, I attempted subtle inquiries, casual questions about her day, her plans, her interactions. She answered with the same practiced composure, her words smooth, almost rehearsed, yet I caught the tiniest cracks, a hesitation before answering, a flicker of emotion passing through her eyes, a slight tremor in her hands. These fragments were not enough to prove anything, but they confirmed what I had feared all along. Something was amiss, and the reality of it would be unavoidable. I began collecting evidence, not in a malicious sense, but out of necessity. Notes, photographs, timestamps, all details that might provide clarity. I monitored her patterns, the ebb and flow of her routines, until a mosaic began to form. It was a complex picture, riddled with ambiguity, yet undeniably pointing toward a hidden truth. Each piece of information I gathered was a step closer to understanding, but also a step deeper into a labyrinth of emotional turmoil. And then, another call arrived. This time, a message that couldn't be dismissed. Meet me tonight. You deserve to see the truth before it's too late. The sender remained anonymous, but the weight of the words was enough to propel me forward. My heart pounded as I considered the implications. The confrontation was imminent, the secret poised to emerge from the shadows, and I could feel the tremors of anticipation coursing through my veins. That night, I prepared meticulously. Every detail mattered. The timing, the route, the way I would approach the building, the manner in which I would confront whatever lay inside. The air was thick with rain, the streets shimmering under the city lights, creating an atmosphere charged with suspense. I approached the door, hand hovering just as it had the first time, and I felt the same tension, the same mixture of dread and determination. Lila appeared, almost unexpectedly, her presence a living embodiment of the storm. Her face was pale, eyes wide, lips slightly parted in a silent admission of fear or guilt. Her body tensed, legs weak, ready to buckle under the weight of the revelation she had been carrying. For a moment, I considered retreating, sparing both of us the inevitable pain, but the need for truth, for clarity, for resolution was too strong. I stepped forward, resolute, heart racing, knowing that the events about to unfold would change everything. And as the door loomed before me, silent yet heavy with anticipation, I realized that this was only the beginning. The secrets, the betrayals, the hidden truths all lay just beyond that threshold. Whatever awaited inside would test my resolve, my love, my understanding of trust, and my capacity for forgiveness. The night stretched before me like a dark promise, and in that charged moment, I knew there was no turning back. The days that followed my discovery of Lila's odd behavior and the mysterious call became a tense rhythm of surveillance and silent observation. Every movement she made, every subtle expression, seemed to carry hidden meaning. I watched her from the corner of my eyes, pretending to read a book or sip my coffee, yet fully aware of every nuance, the way she flinched at a notification, the way her fingers brushed nervously against the edge of her phone. I began cataloging patterns and compiling mental notes that would later serve as the backbone of understanding the secret she was desperately keeping from me. It wasn't merely the fear of betrayal that drove me. It was a need for clarity, for comprehension of a situation that had become increasingly surreal. I remembered the nights we spent laughing on the balcony, the mornings filled with warm coffee and shared plans, and I contrasted those memories with the cold tension of the present. The discrepancy was unbearable. How could someone I loved so deeply harbor secrets that could fracture our lives in a single revelation? Every heartbeat seemed to echo that question, reverberating through the hollow space of my chest. One afternoon, while she thought I was at work, I decided to take a risk. I retrieved her discarded phone from the drawer, an act I justified in my mind as necessary. Every notification, every message, every hidden folder became a window into her private world. At first, there was nothing innocuous communications that seemed mundane. But as I scrolled deeper, patterns began to emerge. There were conversations that hinted at clandestine meetings, at plans executed in secrecy, and at someone she referred to in ambiguous terms, someone whose presence demanded careful obfuscation. My pulse quickened as I processed these fragments. Lila had built a labyrinth of deception, and I was beginning to trace its winding corridors. The revelations were not just about betrayal in a romantic sense. They hinted at deeper entanglements, motives I could barely begin to fathom. The weight of this knowledge was crushing, yet, amidst the growing storm of suspicion, a part of me clung desperately to hope that she had reasons beyond mere deceit, that some explanation would bring clarity rather than despair. That evening, I followed her again, cautious, methodical. The streets glistened from the recent rain, reflecting the distorted glow of streetlights like fractured mirrors. She moved with purpose, yet with caution, her movements a delicate balance between normalcy and secrecy. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this another rendezvous with the man whose presence had haunted our recent days, or something else entirely? The uncertainty was unbearable, yet every instinct compelled me to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. She led me to a modest building I had never noticed before, its unremarkable facade hiding a world I could only speculate about. The door closed behind her, leaving me outside, shivering not from the rain, but from the anticipation of what I might find. The city around me seemed to fade, leaving only the cold pavement beneath my feet and the heavy weight of the unknown pressing against my chest. I knew then that the truth, whatever it might be, would demand a confrontation. Unable to wait passively any longer, I resolved to prepare for that confrontation. I spent the night organizing every observation, every piece of evidence I had collected, forming a coherent narrative of her actions. The process was grueling, both intellectually and emotionally. I oscillated between anger and compassion, suspicion and love, understanding and disbelief. Each memory of our shared past became a double-edged sword, slicing through my resolve with equal parts warmth and pain. The following morning, I attempted a subtle conversation, testing the waters. "Leela, is there anything you want to tell me?" I asked casually, forcing my tone to remain neutral. She paused, a fraction of a second too long, then smiled faintly, brushing it off as nothing. But I noticed every subtle hesitation, every barely perceptible change in expression. The facade was beginning to crack, and I could sense the fear simmering beneath her composure. She knew I was closer to the truth than ever before. Determined to confirm my suspicions, I began piecing together timelines. I compared her claimed errands with timestamps from her social media posts, receipts from stores, and the occasional glimpse from neighbors' observations. Inconsistencies emerged, tiny at first, then increasingly glaring. It became evident that her life had bifurcated, split between the world she shared with me and the world she carefully concealed. The duality was almost elegant in its precision, yet devastating in its implications. As I delved deeper, I also confronted my own feelings. Anger, yes, but also a deep, gnawing sorrow. The realization that someone I loved could craft such meticulous deception was a wound in itself. And yet, even in the depths of betrayal, I felt a strange pull, an urge to understand rather than to condemn, to grasp the why behind the actions rather than simply their consequences. The complexity of human emotion was never more apparent. It was during this time that I noticed subtle shifts in her routine. She began leaving the house later in the evenings, avoiding eye contact more deliberately, and occasionally glancing over her shoulder, as though expecting me to be following. The tension between us escalated silently, an invisible force that charged the air with unspoken questions. I knew the confrontation could happen at any moment, and the anticipation became nearly unbearable. One afternoon, while reviewing her schedule and movements, I discovered a lead, an address scribbled hastily in a notebook. One I hadn't seen before. It matched the building she had entered the previous night. This confirmation, simple yet profound, propelled me forward. I resolved that the next encounter would no longer be one of silent observation. I needed answers, clarity, and perhaps closure. Whatever that might entail, the evening arrived. Heavy with rain and tension, I prepared myself mentally, rehearsing questions, anticipating reactions, steeling my heart for whatever truth awaited. Lila appeared, umbrella in hand, eyes flickering with fear and anticipation. She noticed me immediately, the color draining from her face, her body stiffening as if bracing for impact. I could see every nuance of her internal struggle reflected in her expression, the conflict between concealment and confession, between fear and guilt. As we approached the building together, the world seemed to contract around us, leaving only the two of us. The looming doorway and the weight of the secret waiting inside. My hands were steady now, my resolve firm, even as my heart pounded with uncertainty. Every instinct screamed that the confrontation would redefine our relationship irrevocably, and that the path forward, whatever it might be, would demand courage, honesty, and an unflinching willingness to face consequences. And as the door loomed, silent and foreboding, I realized that this was the moment of truth, the culmination of weeks of observation, suspicion, and internal turmoil was here. What lay beyond would test not only my understanding of Lila, but also my own capacity for trust, forgiveness, and emotional resilience. The night stretched before us like a taut string, and with one breath, I prepared to step into the unknown, to uncover the hidden chapters of our lives, and to confront the raw reality that had been kept from me. The door opened with a low creak, revealing a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly into shadows. I stepped inside cautiously, my senses sharpened to a degree that made every sound, every movement, reverberate like a drumbeat in a silent theater. Lila's hand hovered near mine, hesitant, her body tense with fear. Yet she didn't turn away. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on both of us. I knew, in that instant, that whatever awaited us inside would shatter the fragile equilibrium of our lives. The first room was modest, yet impeccably organized. A leather-bound chair sat near a window, its glass fogged from the rain outside, the faint glow of streetlights filtering through in fractured beams. On a small table lay a stack of letters, neatly arranged, and a laptop left open with a screensaver frozen mid-frame. The subtle scent of perfume lingered faintly in the air, one I didn't recognize. Every detail seemed meticulously curated, as though the room itself were a message, a carefully constructed narrative waiting to be deciphered. And then I saw him. The man, he stood by the window, tall and composed. His expression unreadable, yet undeniably aware of our arrival. His presence was commanding, almost predatory, and I felt an immediate surge of protective anger toward Lila. The tension between us was palpable, a taut wire ready to snap. He didn't speak, merely observed, as though measuring our reactions, gauging the emotional impact before even engaging. Lila's body stiffened beside me, and I could feel her tremor, her hesitation, her silent plea to handle this delicately. "I suppose this isn't a social visit," he finally said, his voice smooth, deliberate, and calm, yet carrying an undercurrent of threat. "You've been asking questions, following, searching for answers. And now you're here." His gaze shifted toward Lila, and I saw something in her eyes, a flash of fear, a flicker of guilt, a conflicted acknowledgement of the situation. I stepped forward, my voice steady, though my heart raced. "Why is she here? What's going on between you two?" The words felt blunt, almost crude, yet they carried the weight of weeks of suspicion, anxiety, and silent torment. The man tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips, as though amused by my ignorance, or perhaps by the inevitability of the confrontation. "It's complicated," he replied, choosing his words carefully, as if each syllable were part of a strategic game. "But you deserve to know some truths, not all, but some, enough to understand why your wife has acted as she has." His eyes locked onto mine, piercing, calculating, forcing me to confront not just the surface of betrayal, but the depth of it. Lila remained quiet, her hands clasped tightly, knuckles white, eyes wide, as though preparing for the storm that was about to unfold. I demanded clarity, my voice rising despite my attempts to remain composed. Enough riddles, speak plainly. What has she done? What secret are you both hiding? The man's lips curved into a subtle, enigmatic smile, and he gestured toward the table. Sit, he said. Listen, I'll explain, but know this. The truth is more intricate than you imagine. Reluctantly, I obeyed, sinking into the chair across from him, my eyes never leaving Lila. Her lips trembled as she attempted to speak, but no words emerged. I could see the storm of guilt, fear, and helplessness raging behind her calm exterior. It was a stark reminder of the emotional complexity of human relationships and the fragile balance between love, loyalty, and deception. The man began to speak, his words deliberate, painting a picture of circumstances I had not anticipated. Lila, he explained, had been involved not merely in a personal liaison, but in a situation that demanded secrecy, strategic discretion, and complex emotional navigation. It was a web of interactions, obligations, and consequences that extended beyond the simplistic notion of betrayal. And yet, the implications for me, for our marriage, were immediate, intense, and unavoidable. I listened, alternately horrified and fascinated, as he detailed the events that had led to this clandestine arrangement. Lila had been protecting someone else, someone vulnerable, while navigating a network of pressures that I had never imagined existed. There were ethical dilemmas, emotional entanglements, and circumstances that forced her into decisions that, on the surface, appeared deceptive, but were motivated by a complex blend of responsibility, fear, and care. Lila's voice finally broke the silence, soft but steady. I never wanted you to find out this way, she said, tears brimming in her eyes. Everything I've done, I did to protect us, to protect others. I never imagined it would hurt you like this. Her words struck me with a mixture of relief and renewed confusion. Relief, because her intentions were not rooted in malice; confusion, because the reality was far more complicated than my suspicion of infidelity had suggested. The room seemed to shrink around us, the walls pressing in with the weight of revelation. I struggled to reconcile the woman I loved with the choices she had made, the secret she had carried alone. The man observed silently, a quiet witness to the emotional turbulence unfolding before him. Every detail, every nuance of expression, every tremor in Lila's hands spoke volumes about the cost of deception, even when it was motivated by protection and care. As the conversation continued, I found myself asking difficult questions, probing for clarity, seeking to understand the motivations, the ethical compromises, and the emotional toll. Lila responded candidly, revealing not just the events themselves, but the fear, the anxiety, and the moral dilemmas that had governed her actions. I could see the depth of her internal struggle, the sacrifices she had made silently, and the profound courage it had taken to navigate such treacherous emotional terrain. By the time the night had deepened and the rain had eased to a soft drizzle, the contours of the situation began to emerge clearly. I understood the choices, the constraints, and the reasons behind her secrecy, and though the initial shock and sense of betrayal lingered, it was tempered by a newfound comprehension of the moral and emotional complexity of the circumstances. The man eventually excused himself, leaving us in the quiet aftermath, and I turned my attention fully to Lila. Her shoulders were slumped, her hands trembling, yet her eyes held a flicker of hope. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt you. I only wanted to protect." In that moment, I realized that the confrontation, while painful, had illuminated truths far beyond the initial suspicion of betrayal. It had revealed the resilience of her character, the depth of her care, and the intricate web of choices that had brought us to this charged, emotionally raw point. We sat together in silence for a long while, absorbing the weight of what had been revealed. The room, once foreboding, now felt like a crucible of understanding, a space where truth and love could coexist despite the fractures in trust. My heart was heavy with residual doubt and lingering anger. but also lightened by the recognition of her courage and the complexity of human decisions in moments of crisis. And as we finally rose to leave, stepping back into the damp streets, I felt a shift within myself. The confrontation had been excruciating, yet necessary. The secrets that had threatened to dismantle our lives were no longer hidden, and the emotional clarity it provided allowed for the first tentative steps toward healing. Though the path ahead remained uncertain, and the fractures in trust required careful attention, the knowledge gained through confrontation offered the promise of reconciliation, understanding, and renewed emotional intimacy. The following morning, the world outside seemed almost indifferent to the storm that had raged within our lives the night before. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening, reflections of streetlights dancing across puddles like fractured memories. I woke with a lingering tension in my chest, a persistent ache that no amount of rational thought could dispel. Lila moved quietly through the apartment, her eyes heavy with the weight of last night's revelations. She avoided my gaze at first, but I could feel her searching for a bridge, an unspoken permission to begin the process of explanation and reconciliation. We sat at the kitchen table, the morning light filtering softly through the blinds, illuminating the contours of her face, the fatigue, the worry, the subtle traces of tears still lingering from the previous night. Her hands trembled slightly as she cradled a mug of coffee, and I noticed the faint, almost imperceptible lines of tension in her shoulders. She spoke slowly, choosing each word with deliberate care, as though the act of articulating the truth required a courage I had never fully appreciated. "I didn't know how to tell you," she began, voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was protecting you, protecting us. Everything I did was meant to prevent harm, to manage a situation that was beyond my control." Her eyes met mine for a fleeting moment, and I saw the raw vulnerability there, the fear of judgment, the anticipation of anger, and the hope for understanding. The complexity of her emotions struck me, blending guilt, fear, and an earnest desire to preserve what we had. I listened, absorbing the details she shared: the clandestine meetings, the careful navigation of obligations that involved others' safety, the delicate balance between loyalty and secrecy. Each revelation chipped away at the initial perception of betrayal I had carried in my chest, replacing it with an intricate understanding of the moral dilemmas she had faced. The situation was not simply a matter of infidelity or deception. It was a labyrinth of ethical and emotional responsibility that she had navigated alone. As she spoke, I began to notice subtleties I had previously overlooked. The way her voice wavered at certain points, the brief flashes of hesitation, the deep breaths she took before revealing particularly sensitive details. These were not signs of guilt in the traditional sense, but rather indicators of the emotional burden she had been carrying. The truth was heavy, and she bore it alone, a solitary sentinel guarding secrets that could have devastated not just our relationship, but the lives of others. I felt a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety. Relief, because the narrative of simple betrayal had been replaced by one of complex moral navigation. Anxiety, because understanding the truth did not erase the consequences, nor did it dissolve the tension that had been building for weeks. The past days had left scars on our trust, on our sense of security, and on the fragile balance of our emotional intimacy. Recognizing this, I knew that the path ahead would require deliberate, patient effort to rebuild what had been strained. Lila continued, describing the external pressures that had forced her into secrecy. There were individuals whose lives depended on her discretion, circumstances that demanded she act with precision and care, and situations where even a minor slip of information could have caused irreparable harm. Her narrative was meticulous, a blend of personal responsibility and ethical obligation, and I found myself increasingly aware of the gravity of the choices she had made. The tension between personal loyalty and moral duty had defined her actions, and understanding this was crucial to reconciling the emotional turbulence we had experienced. Despite the depth of her explanations, there remained moments where the weight of secrecy pressed heavily against her demeanor. She would pause mid-sentence, her gaze drifting to a distant point beyond the walls of the kitchen, as if recalling the gravity of decisions she had made under duress. These pauses were telling, revealing not only the complexity of her experience, but also the inner conflict that had prevented her from sharing the truth sooner. I realized that forgiveness, understanding, and the reconstruction of trust would not be instantaneous. They would require a gradual process, built on the foundation of empathy and emotional resilience. As the morning progressed, we began tentatively discussing the implications of her actions, the ethical considerations that had shaped her choices, and the impact on our relationship. I asked difficult questions, probing for clarity and comprehension, seeking to reconcile my emotions with the intricate reality she had navigated. Leela responded with honesty, her words deliberate, reflective, and unflinchingly transparent. Each answer helped to bridge the gap between suspicion and understanding, gradually replacing fear and resentment with insight and cautious acceptance. I observed her closely, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the fleeting expressions that betrayed vulnerability, and the moments of clarity when she met my gaze directly. These observations reinforced the recognition that human relationships are rarely defined by simplistic binaries of right and wrong. Trust, loyalty, and love are tested not only by overt betrayal, but also by the nuanced challenges of ethical responsibility, emotional complexity, and the weight of concealed truths. By midday, the atmosphere in the apartment had softened, though the residual tension remained. We moved through our routine with careful awareness, each gesture and word carrying unspoken acknowledgement of the previous night's revelations. Even in silence, there was communication, a recognition that while understanding had been achieved, the emotional reconciliation was an ongoing process. I realized that the journey ahead required patience, empathy, and deliberate nurturing of trust, as well as a willingness to confront discomfort, doubt, and residual pain. Later in the afternoon, we decided to take a walk, the streets glistening from recent rain, a gentle drizzle brushing against our faces. The act of leaving the confines of the apartment allowed us to navigate the conversation in a different context, one where movement and environmental stimuli provided a subtle buffer against emotional intensity. As we walked, Lila spoke further about the motivations behind her secrecy, emphasizing the protective intentions and the difficult choices she had faced. Her transparency fostered a tentative sense of clarity, enabling me to contextualize her actions within the broader ethical framework she had been navigating. Throughout the walk, I reflected on the lessons embedded in these experiences. Human relationships, I realized, are complex tapestries woven from threads of trust, vulnerability, ethical responsibility, and emotional nuance. The capacity to navigate deception, whether motivated by protection, fear, or moral obligation, requires both courage and empathy. In acknowledging Leela's struggles, I began to reconcile my own emotions, understanding that the journey from suspicion to comprehension is fraught with challenge, but also rich with the potential for growth and healing. By evening, a fragile equilibrium had begun to form. Lila and I sat together, sharing a quiet meal, the earlier storm now replaced with a tentative calm. Though trust had been shaken and the path ahead uncertain, there was a sense of progress, a recognition that understanding and emotional resilience were slowly restoring the foundation of our relationship. The journey was far from complete, but the first critical steps toward reconciliation had been taken. In those hours, I also began to acknowledge the complexity of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not merely a declaration. It is an ongoing process, a deliberate choice to confront hurt, understand motivation, and allow space for emotional restoration. Lila's honesty, courage, and willingness to confront the consequences of her actions provided the opportunity for that process to begin. I understood that healing would require time, patience, and an unwavering commitment to communication, empathy, and mutual respect. As night fell, we returned home, the streets quiet, the city's hum, a distant background to the contemplative silence that enveloped us. Lila's hand brushed mine briefly, a gesture of connection, tentative yet meaningful. It symbolized the beginning of a new phase in our relationship, a phase defined not by secrecy or deception, but by transparency, emotional accountability, and the shared commitment to navigate the complexities of life together. That evening, I realized that understanding and compassion are not signs of weakness but of strength. By confronting the truth, even when it threatened to unravel the fabric of our lives, we had created a foundation for authentic connection and resilient love. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with moments of doubt and discomfort, but also with the promise of growth, empathy, and the restoration of trust. The days following our tentative reconciliation were a mixture of fragile peace and lingering tension. Though Lila had been forthcoming about her reasons and the circumstances surrounding her secrecy, the shadow of doubt still lingered, a subtle undercurrent in every conversation, every gesture. I knew that understanding alone could not immediately restore trust. It required deliberate action, careful observation, and a conscious effort to rebuild the emotional bridges that had been shaken. I realized that if I were to move forward without the clarity and security I needed, I risked a slow erosion of my own peace of mind. I began to plan cautiously and determined to gather a comprehensive understanding of the entirety of the situation. It was not born of vengeance or spite, but of necessity, a need to ensure that our reconciliation was founded on truth, rather than the partial clarity we had received. I cataloged every interaction, every clue, every fragment of information that had previously gone unnoticed. Notes, photographs, timestamps, subtle behavioral patterns, all were meticulously organized in a mental archive. The aim was not to punish, but to equip myself with the knowledge necessary to navigate the complicated web of relationships, decisions, and consequences that had been hidden from me. Lila, meanwhile, sensed my deliberate observation. She moved with a careful grace, her gestures controlled, her words measured. At first, I worried that my vigilance might alienate her, that she might perceive it as distrust rather than a search for understanding. Yet, over time, she seemed to accept it as a necessary phase, a part of the healing process. There were moments when our eyes met across the room, a silent acknowledgement of the delicate balance we were maintaining between openness and caution, between trust regained and trust cautiously reconstructed. Each evening, I analyzed her movements, her interactions, her responses to unexpected events. Subtle inconsistencies that might have once caused alarm now served as data points, pieces of a larger puzzle that required careful interpretation. I observed her gestures towards certain contacts on her phone, noting the fleeting tension when messages arrived and the careful management of her responses. Every detail, no matter how minor, contributed to a growing understanding of the mechanisms she had employed to navigate the pressures that had previously dictated secrecy. Simultaneously, I considered my own emotions and motivations. The desire to gather evidence, to understand fully before moving forward, required a delicate balance. I had to manage my own internal storm of suspicion, anger, and hurt, while simultaneously preserving the capacity for empathy, understanding, and eventual forgiveness. Emotional regulation became a daily practice, a conscious effort to prevent reactive decisions from undermining the process of reconciliation. The stakes were high. One misstep, one lapse in judgment, could reignite the very fears and resentments we were striving to resolve. One evening, I decided to confront the remaining uncertainties directly. I approached Lila with calm composure, carefully phrasing my questions to avoid triggering defensiveness while still seeking the clarity I needed. "I need to understand everything, Lila," I said softly, holding her gaze. "Not just what you've told me, but the full scope of what's been happening." Her lips trembled as she absorbed my words, and I could sense the internal deliberation that accompanied each response. She understood that honesty was no longer optional. It was a prerequisite for rebuilding the trust that had been fractured. Her explanations were layered, detailed, and emotionally charged. She spoke of responsibilities, of protective instincts, of complex social and ethical pressures that had necessitated secrecy. She described the individuals involved, the dilemmas she had faced, and the careful choices she had made to prevent harm. The narrative was intricate, at times overwhelming, yet undeniably genuine. As she spoke, I began to piece together the missing context, reconciling my initial perceptions of betrayal with a deeper understanding of her intentions and the circumstances that had shaped her actions. Throughout our conversations, I remained vigilant, yet compassionate. I asked questions, seeking clarification, probing gently to ensure that her account was complete. At times, she faltered, struggling to articulate the depth of her experience and the complexity of her decisions. I realized then that the process of transparency itself was emotionally taxing. Revealing hidden truths, even with the best intentions, carries a profound psychological burden. My role was not only to understand, but also to provide the emotional support necessary for her to navigate that disclosure safely. In addition to verbal clarifications, I began cross-referencing observable patterns from the weeks prior with her account. Timelines of movements, communication logs, and behavioral cues all aligned more coherently than I had initially anticipated. The meticulous nature of her secrecy now became apparent not as a symptom of deception, but as evidence of her careful navigation of extraordinarily complex circumstances. The realization softened the edges of my anger and suspicion, replacing them with cautious admiration for the resilience and judgment she had exhibited under pressure. As our discussions progressed, I also implemented subtle measures to maintain clarity and transparency moving forward. Shared calendars, open access to relevant communications, and mutual check-ins were introduced not as punitive tools, but as mechanisms for rebuilding trust incrementally. The process was delicate, requiring balance to avoid creating an environment of surveillance while simultaneously addressing the legitimate need for reassurance. Each successful exchange reinforced the foundation of trust, while each minor misstep highlighted the fragility of the process and the necessity of patience. Through this deliberate approach, a tentative sense of security began to emerge. I could observe, with increasing confidence, that Lila's actions were aligned with her stated intentions. There were no new anomalies, no unexplained absences, and her behavior became increasingly congruent with transparency and accountability. Each day, the tension between vigilance and understanding lessened, replaced by a cautious optimism that our relationship could endure and recover. Yet, I remained acutely aware that the journey was ongoing. Emotional restoration is not linear. Setbacks and moments of doubt were inevitable. I prepared myself for challenges, knowing that maintaining resilience, empathy, and clarity would be essential. Every interaction was approached with conscious intention, every question framed with care, and every observation interpreted with a balance of scrutiny and compassion. The goal was not control, but comprehension and restoration. Is a process requiring both emotional intelligence and patience. In the evenings, as we shared quiet moments together, I observed subtle signs of relief in Leela's demeanor, the ease in her posture, the softness in her gaze, the gradual reintroduction of warmth in her interactions. These cues reinforced the notion that the process of transparency, accountability, and mutual understanding was effective, and that the delicate threads of trust were beginning to weave themselves back together. While scars remained, both visible and invisible, the potential for healing and renewed intimacy was tangible. Ultimately, the careful observation, meticulous evidence gathering, and deliberate dialogue established a new foundation for our relationship. It was not the absence of past mistakes or hidden truths, but the presence of understanding, empathy, and commitment to ethical and emotional clarity that provided the basis for moving forward. The experience underscored the complexity of human relationships, the necessity of deliberate reconciliation, and the profound resilience required to navigate the interplay of trust, secrecy, and redemption. The fragile balance we had begun to restore was tested almost immediately, as if the universe were intent on reminding us of the fragility of trust and the ever-present shadows of doubt. Lila's cautious attempts at openness were met with my careful vigilance, and the interplay created a tense rhythm in our daily interactions. Even minor inconsistencies, hesitations in speech, a quick glance at her phone, an uncharacteristic sigh sent ripples of suspicion through my mind, igniting questions I struggled to suppress. The emotional tension, once manageable, began to escalate. One evening, a seemingly trivial event became the catalyst for conflict. Leela received a message on her phone, a notification that appeared innocuous to anyone else, but carried weight in our charged environment. She glanced at it quickly, attempting to mask the fleeting expression that crossed her face, but I saw it a subtle tightening of the jaw, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. My pulse quickened, adrenaline rushing, as my mind conjured scenarios both plausible and alarming. The air between us grew dense, charged with unspoken questions, fears, and the accumulated weight of prior revelations. I could no longer restrain my need for clarity. "Who was that?" I asked, voice measured but sharp, my eyes fixed on her. The question hung in the room, heavy and accusatory. Though it carried more than mere suspicion, it was a demand for honesty, for alignment between her words and the truth I was determined to uncover. Lila froze, fingers hovering over her mug, her body stiff with apprehension. I could see the internal debate playing out in micro-expressions, the conflict between complete disclosure and the fear of judgment, between protection and transparency. "It's nothing," she replied softly, a carefully modulated tone designed to diffuse tension, yet inevitably drawing attention to its own fragility. Her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, a subtle acknowledgement that her response might not satisfy the scrutiny it faced. In that moment, I felt the full weight of weeks of anxiety, the pressure of unresolved suspicions, and the desperate need for unequivocal truth. I realized that reconciliation was a delicate dance. One misstep, one poorly timed response, and the equilibrium we had painstakingly established could collapse entirely. The argument escalated quickly, fueled by weeks of restrained emotion and unspoken doubts. Words, once chosen carefully and measuredly, began to spill forth with uncontrolled intensity. Accusations mingled with pleas, fear with frustration, and love with betrayal. The apartment, once a sanctuary, became a charged arena where the emotional turbulence threatened to consume both of us. I struggled to maintain composure, to listen amidst the storm of my own emotions, and to respond with the balance required to navigate the confrontation without causing irreparable harm. Lila, too, was caught in the maelstrom of emotion. Her posture became rigid, hands gripping the edge of the counter, knuckles white. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, reflecting a mixture of guilt, fear, and defensiveness. I recognized in her the same desperation. I felt myself a need for validation, for understanding, for the reassurance that our relationship could survive this crucible. And yet, the intensity of the moment made that reassurance nearly impossible to convey. As both of us were ensnared by the raw immediacy of our emotions, the confrontation forced us into truths we had long avoided. Lila admitted that some aspects of her secrecy had been motivated not solely by protection of others, but by a fear of my reaction, a fear that disclosure could lead to irrevocable damage. The admission was painful, not because it introduced new betrayals, but because it exposed the fragility of trust and the vulnerability inherent in emotional concealment. I felt the sharp sting of disappointment, tempered by understanding, the realization that human fear often dictates behavior as strongly as moral or ethical considerations. As the argument subsided, exhaustion replaced adrenaline, leaving a heavy, palpable silence. We both sank into the aftermath, processing the confrontation, the emotional rawness, and the implications for our relationship. The apartment, now quiet, seemed charged with a new awareness, a recognition that reconciliation required more than honesty. It demanded emotional endurance, empathy, and the willingness to confront discomfort without retreating. Every gesture, every glance, every word became a measured step along the precarious path toward rebuilding trust. I spent that night reflecting deeply, considering both her perspective and my own. The complexity of human emotion, the interplay of fear, love, and moral responsibility became strikingly apparent. Trust, I realized, is not an immutable constant, but a dynamic construct, continuously tested by circumstance, choice, and perception. The argument had revealed vulnerabilities on both sides, but it had also illuminated the possibility of genuine understanding, provided we approached each subsequent interaction with patience, empathy, and deliberate care. In the days that followed, we implemented subtle measures to stabilize our interactions. We established new routines designed to foster transparency while respecting boundaries. Check-ins became more structured, communication more deliberate, and shared activities more mindful. Every minor success, a completed conversation without escalation, a moment of mutual understanding, served as reinforcement, gradually repairing the fissures created by secrecy and suspicion. The tension, once oppressive, began to ebb, replaced by a cautious optimism grounded in deliberate effort rather than naive trust. Even as we moved forward, the memory of the argument lingered, a reminder of the work yet to be done. Emotional scars were not erased instantly. They required acknowledgement, reflection, and ongoing engagement. I recognized that forgiveness, while critical, was a process, one that demanded both self-awareness and the willingness to empathize with the experiences and motivations of the other. Lila's courage in facing the consequences of her secrecy provided the foundation, but my own commitment to navigate discomfort and uncertainty was equally essential. Throughout this period, subtle gestures became critical indicators of progress. A lingering touch, a shared glance, or a quiet conversation about a minor concern were all imbued with significance. Each instance reinforced the tentative restoration of trust, demonstrating that even in the aftermath of profound tension, relationships can endure when nurtured with care, patience, and emotional intelligence. The process was neither linear nor simple, but the trajectory was toward healing, toward renewed intimacy, and toward the establishment of a relational dynamic grounded in authenticity rather than pretense. By the end of the week, the atmosphere between us had shifted noticeably. While the argument remained a vivid memory, it no longer dominated our interactions. Lila and I navigated our conversations with increased attentiveness, allowing for moments of vulnerability and shared understanding. The residual tension, once a pervasive force, had transformed into a manageable awareness of the complexity of trust, secrecy, and emotional resilience. We were learning, together, to balance transparency with empathy and accountability with forgiveness. The experience underscored an essential truth. Relationships, particularly those tested by secrecy and betrayal, demand active engagement, deliberate effort, and emotional courage. The argument, while painful, had been a necessary crucible, exposing weaknesses and vulnerabilities that required attention. It was through confrontation, not avoidance, that we began to rebuild our connection, laying the groundwork for a deeper, more resilient intimacy. By nightfall, as we sat together quietly, the tension had eased sufficiently to allow reflection. Lila's hand brushed against mine in a gesture of tentative reconciliation, a subtle acknowledgement of the shared effort required to navigate the complex emotional terrain. I responded with measured warmth, recognizing that the process of rebuilding trust was ongoing, and that each day offered opportunities to reinforce understanding, empathy, and the commitment to move forward together. The argument, in retrospect, was a turning point. It revealed not only the fragility of trust, but also the capacity for resilience, understanding, and deliberate reconciliation. By confronting difficult truths and navigating emotional turbulence with intentionality. We had taken critical steps toward healing a journey that would continue, requiring patience, reflection, and the unwavering commitment to authenticity and empathy. Just when I thought the turbulence of the past weeks had settled into a manageable rhythm, an unexpected twist shattered the fragile calm we had begun to construct. It started with a simple envelope, slipped under the door late one evening. No return address, no name, just a crisp, white envelope with my initials penned neatly on the front. I hesitated before picking it up, my mind racing with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Something about the envelope felt like a silent alarm, a warning that the equilibrium we had fought to establish was about to be tested once more. Inside, I found a series of photographs and a short note. The photographs depicted moments I had never known, images of Lila meeting with the man we had confronted weeks ago, but now, with an additional figure I did not recognize. The note was brief, cryptic. "There's more to this than you realize. Be careful whom you trust." The words, simple and stark, ignited a storm of questions in my mind. Who had sent this? How did they know? And most importantly, what did it mean for the fragile trust I had begun to rebuild? I felt a rush of conflicting emotions: anger, fear, suspicion, and a simmering curiosity that I could not ignore. The photographs suggested layers of secrecy that even Lila's explanations had not accounted for. I grappled with the possibility that there were still truths hidden from me, motives concealed behind smiles and careful words. The ambiguity gnawed at me, a relentless reminder that understanding and reconciliation are processes rather than endpoints. I realized that the journey to clarity was far from over, and that patience alone would not suffice without action. Unable to contain the tension, I confronted Lila that evening. She looked startled, her hands momentarily frozen mid-motion, her eyes wide as she caught sight of the envelope in my hand. I don't know who sent that," I said, my voice a mixture of controlled frustration and desperate need for honesty. "But it implies there's something you haven't told me. Who is this person? What's really happening?" Her reaction was immediate, a subtle flicker of panic crossing her features before she composed herself. She looked away, searching for words that would explain the unexplainable. "I didn't send it," she whispered, voice trembling slightly. "I don't know who did, but I suppose it's time I tell you the rest." Her admission hung in the air like a fragile bridge, one that could either connect us further or collapse under the weight of the truth. I braced myself, knowing that whatever came next could redefine not only our relationship, but my understanding of the events that had brought us to this charged, emotional juncture. She began slowly, recounting a network of circumstances I had never imagined. Beyond her meetings with the man I had already confronted, there had been others involved, individuals connected to obligations she had undertaken out of necessity, secrecy, and ethical responsibility. Each encounter had been carefully orchestrated, timed precisely, and executed with a level of discretion designed to protect multiple parties. The complexity was staggering, far beyond the simplistic notion of infidelity or personal betrayal I had feared. It was a web of responsibilities, emotional risks, and moral choices, all navigated under immense pressure. As she spoke, I noticed the strain in her voice, the subtle pauses, and the moments of vulnerability that punctuated her narrative. It became clear that the secrecy had been a matter of survival, both emotionally and practically. She had been balancing not only her obligations to me, but also to individuals whose well-being depended on her discretion. The realization brought a mix of relief and renewed apprehension. Relief, because her actions were not motivated by malice. Apprehension, because the scope of the secrecy was far greater than I had anticipated. I listened intently, my mind racing to assimilate the layers of information. Each revelation demanded a reassessment of my assumptions, a recalibration of my emotional responses. The initial anger and fear that had dominated my reactions were now tempered by a recognition of the ethical and emotional complexity of her decisions. I began to see the intricate dance of intentions, obligations, and consequences that had dictated her behavior, understanding that truth and trust exist on a spectrum rather than as binary absolutes. Despite this comprehension, I could not ignore the lingering tension. The presence of an additional unknown figure raised new questions, new uncertainties. Who were they? What role did they play in the unfolding drama? Could they be trusted, or were they another source of deception? The ambiguity was unsettling, a reminder that even the most meticulously constructed reality is vulnerable to disruption. I realized that while Lila's transparency was crucial, it was insufficient alone. The surrounding context, the external variables, also demanded attention and careful navigation. Determined to uncover the full picture, I began a meticulous review of recent events, cross-referencing details from her account with observable patterns, timelines, and previous anomalies. The process was exhaustive, requiring both analytical precision and emotional restraint. I noted subtle behavioral cues, traced interactions, and analyzed inconsistencies that might have previously seemed insignificant. Each discovery added depth to the narrative, clarifying motives, timelines, and consequences that had previously been obscured. Lila, sensing my intent, provided full cooperation, answering questions, clarifying details, and allowing access to communications and documentation. The process was emotionally taxing for both of us, a rigorous exploration of vulnerability and accountability. At times, the tension flared, triggering arguments and moments of doubt. Yet, with each exchange, understanding deepened, trust was cautiously reinforced, and the foundation of our relationship became incrementally stronger. As days passed, the unknown figure's identity slowly emerged. They were connected to a critical aspect of Lila's obligations, someone whose safety and well-being had depended on her discretion. The revelations reframed the context entirely. What had initially appeared as potential betrayal was, in fact, an extension of her protective and ethical responsibilities. The narrative of secrecy was not rooted in selfishness or malice, but in courage, empathy, and moral duty. Understanding this required a profound recalibration of my emotional framework, a willingness to navigate discomfort, and the capacity for deep empathy. By the end of the week, the tension that had surged with the arrival of the envelope had transformed into clarity and comprehension. The web of secrecy was fully revealed, the unknown figure's role understood, and the motivations behind Lila's actions comprehensible. The initial shock and suspicion had given way to an informed understanding, allowing for deliberate steps toward reconciliation, emotional restoration, and renewed intimacy. In reflecting on this twist, I recognized the essential lesson embedded within it. Human behavior, especially in complex relational contexts, is rarely reducible to simplistic notions of right and wrong. Ethical dilemmas, emotional pressures, and the burden of responsibility shape decisions in ways that can appear opaque to external observers. Trust, therefore, requires not only belief in honesty, but also the patience and empathy to navigate the nuanced realities of human motivation. By nightfall, as Leela and I sat together quietly, a tentative sense of resolution settled over us. The tension, once acute, had been mitigated by transparency, dialogue, and the mutual acknowledgement of complexity, though the journey was far from complete, and the emotional scars of secrecy remained. The revelation had provided a foundation for genuine understanding and the possibility of resilient, enduring trust. The confrontation was inevitable. The weeks of subtle observation, careful questioning, and painstaking analysis had led to this moment, a direct collision of truths, emotions, and consequences. That evening, I met Leela at the apartment, both of us aware that our steps were guided not merely by curiosity, but by the necessity to resolve the lingering uncertainties that had shadowed our relationship. The air between us was thick with anticipation, each gesture and glance weighted with unspoken questions and the remnants of past tension. We left the apartment together, the streets glistening under the recent rain, the city lights reflecting like fractured memories on the wet pavement. I could feel her tension as we walked side by side, the occasional brush of her hand against mine, carrying both reassurance and a silent plea for understanding. The man, the one who had initially catalyzed the unraveling of our trust, awaited at the designated location. I had prepared mentally for this encounter, rehearsing questions, anticipating reactions, and bracing for the emotional turbulence that was certain to follow. When we arrived, he was waiting, calm and composed, his posture deliberate, his gaze fixed on us with an intensity that immediately heightened my alertness. Lila's grip on my arm tightened momentarily, a subtle acknowledgement of her own anxiety and the shared stakes of the confrontation. I took a measured breath, reminding myself that this encounter was not merely about conflict, but about clarity, accountability, and the pursuit of truth. "Thank you for coming," he said smoothly, his voice carrying both authority and an almost imperceptible undercurrent of tension. "We have matters to discuss." His eyes flicked toward Lila, and I could see a flash of fear and hesitation, a reflection of the precarious balance that had defined her recent actions. Every nuance of her body language, every micro-expression, conveyed the complexity of her internal state, guilt, concern, and a fragile hope that the confrontation would not unravel what little trust remained. I spoke first, carefully but firmly. "I need full transparency. No omissions, no evasions. I want to understand the scope of your involvement and the impact on Lila and our relationship." My voice carried the weight of weeks of accumulated suspicion, fear, and the emotional labor of navigating uncertainty. The man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the gravity of my request. "Very well," he replied. "But understand that the truth is layered. Some aspects are not straightforward, and the consequences may be more significant than you anticipate." The conversation that followed was intense, a careful unfolding of events that had previously been obscured. He detailed interactions, decisions, and motives, illustrating the network of relationships and ethical dilemmas that had necessitated secrecy. Leela's role was central, yet fraught with difficulty. Her choices had been dictated not by malice, but by the demands of protection, loyalty, and ethical responsibility. Each revelation added complexity, challenging my initial assumptions and compelling me to reframe my understanding of both Lila and the circumstances surrounding her secrecy. As the discussion progressed, I found myself balancing multiple emotions: anger at the hidden truths, relief that motives were rooted in care rather than betrayal, and a persistent anxiety about the unresolved elements of the narrative. Lila's presence beside me was both reassuring and poignant. Her eyes occasionally met mine, conveying apology, hope, and the desire for comprehension. The tension was almost unbearable, yet it was precisely this emotional intensity that underscored the significance of the confrontation. At one point, the man presented evidence documents, communications, and visual records that contextualized the decisions Lila had made. The materials were precise, detailed, and illuminated aspects of the situation that I had only suspected. The clarity was simultaneously shocking and necessary. I could see the intricate web of cause and effect, the deliberate orchestration of actions to minimize harm, and the ethical rigor underpinning her choices. This evidence reframed the narrative entirely. What had once appeared as potential betrayal was now understood as complex navigation of moral responsibility under pressure. I directed questions at Lila, seeking to confirm details, clarify ambiguities, and understand her perspective in real time. Her responses were candid, emotionally charged, and deeply human. She admitted fears, regrets, and the psychological toll of maintaining secrecy, offering insight into the intense internal conflicts she had endured. I realized then that understanding is not a passive state. It is an active engagement, a negotiation between emotion and cognition, and a willingness to witness vulnerability without retreating. The man observed silently for long stretches, intervening only to provide clarifying details or to correct misinterpretations. His presence was both authoritative and non-threatening, a facilitator rather than an adversary in the conversation. Despite the emotional intensity, the dialogue remained controlled, a testament to the gravity of the situation and the necessity of precision in communicating truth under pressure. Each word, pause, and gesture carried significance, influencing the unfolding narrative and shaping the trajectory of reconciliation. Lila's demeanor evolved over the course of the encounter. Initial tension gradually gave way to cautious openness, her shoulders relaxing slightly, her voice gaining steadiness, and her gaze meeting mine with increasing confidence. I noted these changes, recognizing that emotional reconciliation is iterative. Small signs of trust, transparency, and vulnerability signal progress, even in the context of ongoing tension. The confrontation, while initially threatening, had become a vehicle for deepened understanding and the reestablishment of relational equilibrium. Toward the conclusion of the meeting, the man summarized the key points, emphasizing the ethical imperatives, constraints, and protective motives that had guided Lila's decisions. The weight of responsibility she had carried alone was substantial, and the confirmation of her intentions provided a framework within which to contextualize past secrecy. I felt a complex mix of relief, lingering wariness, and emerging empathy. Understanding, I realized, does not erase emotional turbulence, but allows it to be integrated constructively, creating the potential for healing and trust reconstruction. As we left the meeting, the night air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked pavement. Lila walked beside me, her hand brushing mine in a gesture of tentative reconciliation. I sensed both the vulnerability and the resilience in that touch, a symbolic acknowledgement of shared effort, accountability, and the willingness to confront the difficult truths of our relationship. The encounter, though emotionally taxing, had provided clarity, addressed ambiguities, and illuminated a path forward that was grounded in understanding, empathy, and deliberate trust building. Once home, we sat together in quiet reflection. The apartment, previously a space charged with tension, now felt like a sanctuary of emotional processing. We discussed the events, revisited key points, and acknowledged the emotional consequences for each of us. The act of verbalizing thoughts, emotions, and reflections reinforced the recalibration of our relational framework, allowing us to approach reconciliation not as a passive state, but as an active, ongoing process. I realized that confrontation, while daunting and fraught with risk, is essential in restoring integrity to a relationship challenged by secrecy and uncertainty. By addressing the unknown, seeking clarity, and engaging directly with difficult truths, we had begun to reestablish a foundation for trust, transparency, and emotional resilience. Lila's courage in facing accountability, combined with my commitment to understanding, created a relational environment capable of enduring the challenges of past betrayals and the complexities of human decision-making. The evening concluded with a tentative sense of closure, not complete resolution, but sufficient clarity to allow for reflection, processing, and the gradual rebuilding of trust. I recognized that the path ahead would continue to require patience, empathy, and deliberate engagement. Yet, for the first time in weeks, the tension that had dominated our interactions was replaced by a cautious optimism, a recognition that transparency, accountability, and emotional courage provide the scaffolding for healing, even in the aftermath of profound emotional turbulence. The morning after the confrontation was heavy with an unfamiliar weight. The apartment felt smaller, the air dense, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension from the night before. Lila moved slowly, her gestures careful, measured, almost tentative. Each movement seemed to carry the memory of what had transpired. The confrontation with the man, the exposure of truths long buried, and the emotional unraveling we had both endured. I, too, felt the residual echo of that night, a combination of relief, exhaustion, and a persistent undercurrent of uncertainty. We tried to resume normal routines, but the fragility of trust made even mundane interactions feel precarious. Breakfast, once casual and comforting, was now laden with unspoken acknowledgement of our recent emotional turbulence. Lila's eyes avoided mine intermittently, as though seeking reassurance without provoking further tension. While I struggled to maintain composure, balancing my desire for clarity with the need to allow her space for reflection and processing, every glance, every gesture became amplified in significance, a subtle signal of internal state and emotional alignment. The residual impact of secrecy and revelation manifested most acutely in moments of silence. When words were absent, the mind filled in gaps with speculation, doubt, and fear. I found myself replaying the confrontation repeatedly, analyzing her expressions, her tone, and the minutiae of her behavior. Each analysis was a double-edged sword, providing insight into her state, yet reinforcing the intensity of emotional turbulence. Lila, sensing the scrutiny, grew quieter, her internal anxiety palpable in subtle ticks, fingers drumming on the counter, shifting weight from foot to foot, eyes flicking toward the window as though seeking an external anchor. Despite the wait, we attempted conversation, tentative at first. I asked questions carefully, aiming to avoid triggering defensiveness while still seeking understanding. Lila responded with honesty, yet her voice occasionally wavered, betraying lingering apprehension. The emotional labor of our interactions was substantial. We were negotiating not just reconciliation, but also the psychological aftermath of betrayal, secrecy, and moral complexity. The process demanded patience, empathy, and the ability to navigate discomfort without retreating. In the late morning, an unexpected visitor arrived, a neighbor, concerned after noticing our prolonged emotional withdrawal and subtle signs of strain. The conversation was brief, but it highlighted the social ramifications of personal crises. Even private emotional turbulence can ripple outward, influencing perceptions, interactions, and the broader context in which relationships exist. The intrusion was minor, yet it underscored a critical point. Emotional recovery is not conducted in isolation. Support, acknowledgement, and external validation can be essential in stabilizing relational dynamics following betrayal and conflict. By mid-afternoon, the emotional toll of the past events began to manifest physically. Lila complained of fatigue, headaches, and a persistent tightness in her chest. I, too, felt an unusual lethargy, the mental strain of vigilance, confrontation, and reconciliation weighing heavily. We both recognize that emotional trauma is embodied. It does not remain confined to the psyche, but extends into the body, influencing energy, behavior, and perception. Understanding this allowed us to approach each other with compassion, acknowledging not only the psychological, but also the physiological impacts of our experiences. The most challenging moment arrived when a minor disagreement escalated unexpectedly. A question about daily routine trivial under ordinary circumstances became a trigger for latent tension. Leela's response was defensive, mine was measured but firm, and suddenly we were both navigating a microcosm of the larger emotional landscape we had been managing. Words were exchanged carefully, yet charged with underlying emotion. In that exchange, the fragility of trust, the persistence of residual doubt, and the complexity of forgiveness became starkly apparent. Each sentence required careful calibration. Each response demanded restraint, empathy, and reflection. After the disagreement subsided, we retreated to separate spaces within the apartment, each processing the incident individually. Lila sat by the window, staring at the city skyline, hands clasped, mind racing with regret and anxiety. I paced the living room, attempting to regulate breathing and heart rate, considering the dynamics that had led to the escalation. Reflection revealed that even minor provocations could ignite latent stress when trust is compromised, underscoring the necessity of deliberate emotional management and conscious communication in the aftermath of relational crises. Later, we reconvened, acknowledging the escalation and discussing its underlying causes. The dialogue was more structured, focused on understanding triggers, motivations, and responses rather than attributing blame. We identified patterns, moments of perceived avoidance, subtle cues of apprehension, and the influence of prior secrets on current interpretations. By externalizing these dynamics, we were able to reduce the intensity of personal accusation, instead framing the discussion as a collaborative analysis aimed at preventing future miscommunications and emotional ruptures. By evening, the initial shock and emotional turbulence had begun to stabilize, replaced by a cautious sense of equilibrium. Lila and I shared a simple meal, the act itself symbolizing a return to shared experience and the gradual reconstruction of relational norms. Conversation was sparse but meaningful, focused on mutual understanding, acknowledgement of previous errors, and recognition of each other's emotional labor, even in silence. There was a shared awareness of the ongoing process, a non-verbal communication that reinforced connection, trust, and emerging stability. As night fell, we prepared for rest, each mindful of the need for personal recovery. In addition to relational repair, the apartment, once charged with tension, now held a quiet, tentative calm. I reflected on the week's events, the confrontation, revelations, subsequent tensions, and minor escalations, and recognized the depth of psychological and emotional work required for recovery. Healing is neither immediate nor linear. It is iterative, demanding attention, empathy, and a continuous willingness to confront discomfort without avoidance. Ultimately, the events of the day underscored the consequences of past secrecy and the emotional costs of disclosure under duress. The microcosm of minor conflicts, physiological strain, and social awareness illuminated the broader dynamics of relational recovery. Lila's courage, combined with deliberate transparency and my commitment to understanding, created conditions for incremental trust rebuilding. Yet, the experience also highlighted the persistent vulnerability inherent in emotional intimacy, the ease with which past breaches can trigger renewed uncertainty, anxiety, and conflict. By the end of the night, I recognized a crucial insight. Emotional recovery requires both recognition of the tangible consequences of prior actions and deliberate attention to ongoing relational dynamics. Trust, once fractured, necessitates iterative reinforcement, empathetic engagement, and the willingness to navigate residual pain. While the day had presented challenges, it also offered progress proof that even in the wake of profound emotional disruption, deliberate effort, patience, and understanding can guide a relationship toward resilience and renewal. The tension from the previous days had crystallized into a determination within me, a resolve to establish clarity, justice, and balance in a situation that had spiraled far beyond initial suspicion. I realized that passive observation or cautious dialogue alone could not fully address the lingering uncertainties and moral ambiguities. I needed a strategy, a deliberate approach to navigate the remaining complexities and ensure that both Lila and I could move forward with understanding, accountability, and emotional integrity. I began by consolidating everything I had learned: timelines, interactions, communications, and subtle behavioral cues. The details were meticulously cataloged, not as a weapon for punishment, but as a map of truth, an analytical framework to guide decisions in an emotionally charged environment. Each entry was cross-referenced, every nuance evaluated, ensuring that no detail, however minor, was overlooked. This process demanded mental rigor, patience, and a commitment to impartiality, as emotional impulses threatened repeatedly to skew my judgment. With the foundation of information in place, I crafted a deliberate plan for confrontation and resolution, It was not motivated by vengeance, but by the necessity of transparency, accountability, and clarity. My goal was to confront the remaining ambiguities head-on, to address unanswered questions, and to ensure that no residual deceit remained unexamined. The strategy involved a structured sequence of interactions: initial private dialogue with Lila, follow-up clarification with external parties, and the careful review of documented evidence. Each step was designed to minimize unnecessary conflict while maximizing understanding and resolution. Lila, aware of my intentions, approached the process with cautious cooperation. Her posture was tense but composed, her expressions measured, reflecting both apprehension and recognition of the necessity for resolution. As we engaged in the first phase of our plan, the dialogue focused on clarifying motivations, actions, and consequences. Leela articulated the ethical pressures, moral considerations, and emotional constraints that had dictated her behavior. Her explanations were candid, emotionally resonant, and occasionally punctuated by visible signs of stress, quivering lips, subtle hand tremors, and brief pauses for composure. During this exchange, I asked questions that required honesty and reflection. Each response provided insight into her thought processes, her protective instincts, and the difficult choices she had made. I observed carefully, noting both verbal content and nonverbal cues, integrating these signals into my broader understanding of the situation. The process was emotionally taxing for both of us, demanding patience, empathy, and a conscious effort to manage the intensity of the dialogue. I recognized that reconciliation was not merely about information exchange. It was a complex negotiation of trust, emotional safety, and accountability. The next phase involved a delicate review of external interactions. I sought confirmation from individuals tangentially connected to the circumstances, verifying timelines, communications, and decisions. This phase required both subtlety and discretion. As I navigated the potential for additional conflicts or misunderstandings, each confirmation reinforced elements of Lila's narrative, reducing the residual uncertainty and providing a clearer understanding of the broader context. The clarity offered by these confirmations was invaluable, enabling both a psychological and emotional recalibration of trust. Throughout this process, I remained conscious of my own emotional regulation. The intensity of scrutiny, combined with the history of betrayal and secrecy, had the potential to provoke reactive responses. I implemented deliberate strategies to maintain composure, structured note-taking, mental rehearsal of questions, controlled breathing, and periods of reflective solitude. These practices allowed me to approach each interaction with Lila and external parties from a place of deliberate intention rather than impulsive emotion, preserving the integrity of the reconciliation process. As the plan progressed, it became evident that accountability and transparency were essential not only for my comprehension, but also for Lila's emotional restoration. The act of articulating decisions, reflecting on motivations, and acknowledging consequences provided her with a structured opportunity to process her own emotional experiences. This mutual engagement facilitated a shift from defensive posturing to collaborative understanding, reinforcing the principles of trust, empathy, and relational resilience. A critical moment arose during the final phase of the strategy. When previously ambiguous actions and communications were addressed directly, the discussion required careful navigation, balancing the need for clarity with sensitivity to emotional impact. Lila responded with honesty, admitting residual uncertainties, past mistakes in judgment, and moments where fear had influenced discretion. The transparency was emotionally powerful, exposing vulnerabilities that had been shielded from view, yet were central to understanding the complexity of the situation. The culmination of this deliberate approach was a moment of profound clarity. Every remaining ambiguity had been addressed, every interaction contextualized, and every ethical and emotional consideration examined. I could see the intricate tapestry of decisions, constraints, and moral imperatives that had guided Lila's behavior. The picture was no longer one of deception alone, but of conscientious navigation through extraordinary circumstances, balancing protection, responsibility, and relational integrity. In the aftermath, I felt a mixture of relief, residual caution, and a tentative optimism. The plan had achieved its intended purpose: to uncover truth, establish clarity, and foster accountability without provoking unnecessary conflict or emotional harm. Leela and I shared a quiet acknowledgement of the effort, recognizing that the resolution was not an endpoint, but a foundation for ongoing trust building and emotional reconstruction. The sense of accomplishment was tempered by the understanding that relational resilience is a continuous process, requiring vigilance, empathy, and deliberate communication. By evening, the atmosphere between us had shifted noticeably. The previous tension had given way to a measured calm, punctuated by small gestures of reassurance, a brief touch, shared eye contact, a soft acknowledgement of progress. The deliberate strategy had not only clarified the factual and ethical dimensions of the situation, but had also fostered an emotional realignment, allowing both of us to engage with one another from a place of informed understanding rather than suspicion or fear. This experience underscored a crucial insight: in situations where secrecy, moral complexity, and relational strain intersect, deliberate strategy, accountability, and transparent engagement are essential. Emotional intelligence, patience, and the capacity to regulate one's own responses are equally critical in ensuring that reconciliation is constructive rather than destructive. Lila's cooperation, courage, and willingness to confront consequences, combined with my structured approach to understanding, created conditions for healing, trust restoration, and the potential for renewed relational intimacy. By the end of the night, as we sat together in reflective silence, I recognized the transformative power of deliberate confrontation and resolution. The strategy we had implemented provided not only clarity and understanding, but also a framework for ongoing emotional resilience. The path forward would require continued vigilance, empathy, and mutual accountability, yet the foundation for sustainable trust and relational growth had been firmly established. The night air was thick and electric as we approached the location for the final confrontation. Rain had begun to fall again, light at first, then intensifying into a steady downpour that glistened against the streetlights like fractured glass. Every step toward the building felt like a countdown to a reckoning long overdue. Leela's hand brushed mine briefly, a tentative gesture, one that carried both apprehension and silent encouragement. I felt her tension, mirrored by my own, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and the urgent need for resolution. Inside, the room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls, creating a chiaroscuro of uncertainty and suspense. The man who had been the catalyst of our previous turmoil waited, calm, composed, yet with a presence that conveyed unmistakable control. Lila's posture was rigid, but her eyes reflected determination and courage, a quiet acknowledgement of the confrontation that had to take place. I steadied myself, aware that what was about to unfold would test not only our understanding of the situation, but also the depth of our emotional resilience. The initial moments were tense, silence hanging heavily as we assessed one another. The storm outside matched the one within, each droplet of rain a rhythmic punctuation to the unspoken questions swirling in the room. Finally, I spoke. My voice measured yet firm, carrying the weight of weeks of suspicion, discovery, and emotional strain. We need clarity, every detail. No omissions, no obfuscations. My gaze swept between Lila and him, the unspoken gravity of the request, hanging in the air like a charged wire ready to snap. The man began to speak, his words deliberate and precise, recounting the sequence of events with meticulous attention to detail. Each revelation peeled back another layer of complexity: motives, ethical dilemmas, unintended consequences, and calculated risks. Lila had been navigating a labyrinth of obligations and secrecy, each decision influenced by the necessity to protect others while maintaining moral integrity. The narrative was intricate, at times overwhelming, yet undeniably truthful, demanding both comprehension and emotional engagement from me. As the conversation unfolded, I noticed subtle shifts in Lila's demeanor. Her hands, initially clenched, gradually relaxed. Her eyes, previously darting nervously, now met mine with a mixture of vulnerability and resolve. I realized that the act of confronting the truth was both liberating and terrifying for her. Each acknowledgement of past choices, each admission of fear or misjudgment was a step toward mutual understanding and the restoration of trust. The intensity of the moment underscored the gravity of transparency, the courage required to reveal not only actions, but the complex web of motivations, consequences, and ethical considerations. I questioned both of them, probing for clarity on unresolved points, seeking to reconcile discrepancies, and ensuring that all remaining ambiguities were addressed. Lila responded candidly, her voice occasionally faltering, betraying the emotional weight of her confessions. I felt the rawness of her vulnerability, the courage it took to stand exposed emotionally. Knowing that my judgment could tip the balance between reconciliation and fracture, each answer deepened my understanding, reframing perceived betrayals as complex navigations of responsibility, protection, and ethical obligation. The man's presence added an additional layer of tension, a reminder that external variables had influenced Lila's decisions and that her secrecy had been as much about safeguarding others as managing our relationship. His recounting was precise, factual, devoid of malice, yet carrying the weight of consequences, decisions that could have irreparably altered lives had they been mismanaged. I listened, processing the information, feeling a mixture of relief, respect, and the lingering pangs of apprehension. A turning point occurred when Lila detailed a critical decision she had made under duress, a choice that, if revealed too early, could have destroyed our trust entirely. Her confession was raw, accompanied by visible signs of stress, trembling fingers, quivering lips, and brief pauses to compose herself. I absorbed each detail, my emotions a turbulent mixture of empathy, relief, and the sober acknowledgement of the gravity of her responsibilities. It became evident that the complexity of her situation demanded a level of courage and foresight I had not fully appreciated. As the dialogue continued, I began to see the full scope of the narrative. What had initially appeared as deception was, in fact, a series of ethically challenging decisions made to protect multiple individuals while minimizing harm. Lila's secrecy was not a reflection of malice, but of a careful balancing act, navigating the tension between transparency, protection, and moral responsibility. The recognition of this complexity transformed my understanding, replacing residual anger with a measured comprehension of her intentions and the difficult circumstances she had endured. The climax of the confrontation arrived with the discussion of consequences. Each party acknowledged the impact of past decisions, the emotional strain, the relational fractures, and the lingering questions of trust and accountability. Lila's courage in revealing these truths, coupled with the factual precision provided by the man, created a framework for resolution. The room, once charged with suspense and tension, now became a space for deliberate reflection, empathy, and the acknowledgement of mutual responsibility in navigating the complex interplay of human relationships. By the time the final details were addressed, a profound sense of clarity emerged. Every ambiguity had been confronted, every ethical dilemma contextualized, and every emotional consequence acknowledged. Lila's transparency, my deliberative questioning, and the man's objective recounting had converged to create an environment in which understanding could flourish. The narrative of betrayal had transformed into a narrative of moral courage, ethical navigation, and relational resilience. As we left the room, The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the night air cool and reflective. Lila walked beside me, her hand brushing mine in a gesture of tentative reconciliation. The intensity of the confrontation lingered, yet it was now tempered by comprehension, empathy, and the recognition of shared effort in navigating a profoundly challenging situation. I realized that the final confrontation had not merely resolved ambiguity, it had also provided the foundation for emotional restoration, trust rebuilding, and the potential for sustained intimacy. Once home, we sat together in quiet reflection. The apartment, previously charged with the remnants of tension and anxiety, now felt like a sanctuary of contemplation. We reviewed key points, articulated lingering questions, and acknowledged the emotional labor required to navigate the confrontation. The deliberate examination of past events, motivations, and consequences reinforced the scaffolding of trust, transparency, and emotional resilience. Every acknowledgement, every pause, every exchange of insight contributed to a foundation upon which our relationship could be reconstructed. By late evening, the atmosphere between us had shifted remarkably. While the scars of secrecy and past tension remained, the emotional landscape had transformed. Lila and I had moved beyond fear, suspicion, and tentative reconciliation toward an informed understanding of one another's choices, motives, and limitations. The culmination of confrontation, transparency, and empathetic engagement had created conditions for sustained relational growth. As I reflected on the day's events, it became clear that high-stakes emotional confrontations, when navigated with intentionality, honesty, and empathy, are powerful mechanisms for restoring clarity and rebuilding trust. The act of facing difficult truths, while fraught with risk, enables both parties to engage authentically, confront vulnerabilities, and co-create a narrative grounded in understanding rather than assumption. In that charged, rain-soaked night, Lila and I experienced not only the resolution of ambiguity, but also the profound potential for relational healing and emotional resilience. The days following the final confrontation were unlike any we had experienced since the storm of revelations began. The tension that had dominated our lives gradually gave way to a delicate calm, though the process of healing was neither linear nor instantaneous. I could feel it in Lila's movements, the way she carried herself with slightly more ease. The subtle relaxation of her shoulders, the unguarded way her eyes met mine, without the flickers of hesitation or fear that had haunted them for weeks. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the apartment seemed less like a theater of suspense and more like a space where true reconciliation could begin. We established a new rhythm, one that emphasized openness, communication, and shared responsibility. Breakfasts were longer, allowing time for conversation and connection. Evenings were dedicated to reflection, reading together, or simply sitting in silence while the weight of past conflicts slowly lifted. Every gesture, no matter how small, became an opportunity to rebuild trust. A touch on the hand, a soft word of affirmation, or a deliberate acknowledgement of each other's effort in navigating the turbulent weeks prior. I realized that healing is constructed incrementally through countless micro moments of affirmation, patience, and empathetic engagement. Emotionally, I felt the necessity to confront my own reactions. The anger, suspicion, and fear that had consumed me in earlier phases of the ordeal had to be examined, understood, and consciously managed. I journaled extensively, recording observations, reflections, and emotional responses. This act of self-examination allowed me to separate past grievances from present intentions, to understand the difference between residual trauma and ongoing relational dynamics, and to approach Lila with a balance of compassion and discernment. Lila, too, engaged in her own process of self-healing. She acknowledged the burden she had carried in secrecy, the ethical dilemmas, the weight of responsibility, and the isolation inherent in her choices. Our conversations explored these experiences deeply, creating a shared space for vulnerability and empathy. She spoke of moments of fear and doubt, of internal conflicts, where the path of moral responsibility conflicted with the desire for transparency and relational harmony. Her honesty was at once humbling and enlightening, reinforcing the necessity of patience, understanding, and deliberate emotional engagement in the reconstruction of trust. We also began setting boundaries that allowed for personal space and reflection while reinforcing relational safety. Lila and I agreed on transparent communication protocols for interactions that had previously been ambiguous or anxiety-inducing. Shared calendars, explicit discussion of social engagements, and the routine verification of intentions were implemented not as surveillance, but as frameworks to rebuild confidence in each other's transparency. These measures, while initially awkward, gradually became stabilizing factors, reducing the likelihood of misinterpretation and fostering a sense of security. Outside of structured dialogue, we engaged in activities designed to foster emotional reconnection. Long walks through the city, quiet moments in parks, and deliberate engagement in shared hobbies allowed us to experience each other beyond the prism of conflict. Each activity became a subtle affirmation of our renewed bond, a reminder that life and connection could exist beyond suspicion and emotional turbulence. Even in silence, the mere act of presence was healing and acknowledgement of survival, resilience, and the potential for restored intimacy. I noticed, over time, that the physiological manifestations of stress, tightness in the chest, shallow breathing, tension, headaches began to ease. Leela expressed similar relief, describing a lighter feeling in her chest, improved sleep, and a gradual reduction in the anxiety that had dominated her recent weeks. It was a tangible demonstration that emotional reconciliation and transparency have corporeal effects, easing the physical manifestations of psychological stress and enabling both individuals to engage more fully in relational rebuilding. The process of emotional restoration was punctuated by moments of reflection and conversation about the past. Yet we were careful not to dwell obsessively on transgressions. Instead, we explored the lessons learned, the importance of patience, the need for honest communication, the necessity of balancing ethical responsibility with relational transparency. These discussions, while occasionally emotionally charged, served to transform prior conflict into learning, understanding, and preparation for a more resilient future. We also established rituals of accountability and affirmation. Each evening, we would share reflections on the day's interactions, acknowledging moments of success in maintaining honesty and empathy, as well as areas where improvement was necessary. These rituals created a feedback loop, reinforcing positive behavior, fostering mutual awareness, and gradually recalibrating our relationship dynamics toward trust and emotional safety. The incremental nature of this process emphasized that healing is iterative, requiring conscious attention, empathy, and a willingness to engage continuously with the emotional landscape of the relationship. By the end of the first week of structured healing, I felt a subtle but profound shift. The emotional turbulence that had once dominated our interactions had given way to a tentative serenity, punctuated by moments of joy, laughter, and genuine connection. Lila's presence no longer triggered reflexive anxiety or suspicion. Instead, her gestures and words began to evoke comfort, warmth, and a cautious optimism for the future. The rebuilding of trust, though ongoing, was now tangible, a living, dynamic process manifested in both emotion and action. I realized that the ultimate value of this period was not merely the restoration of equilibrium, but the deepening of relational insight. We had confronted deception, ethical complexity, and emotional vulnerability, and emerged with a nuanced understanding of each other's motives, fears, and moral considerations. This understanding created a relational depth that transcended mere resolution. It fostered resilience, empathy, and a capacity for genuine intimacy that had previously been obscured by uncertainty and secrecy. As the nights progressed, we began to talk about the future, cautiously envisioning shared goals, mutual support systems, and relational frameworks designed to prevent recurrence of similar tensions. These discussions, conducted with emotional honesty and mutual respect, reinforce the narrative of healing as an active, collaborative endeavor. Each agreement, each shared reflection, strengthened the scaffolding of trust and intimacy, creating conditions for sustained relational growth. By the second week, Lila and I were navigating life with a new equilibrium. The past, though present in memory, no longer dominated our interactions or dictated our emotions. We had transformed crisis into opportunity. Opportunity to understand, empathize, and reconnect. The healing process, iterative and deliberate, had produced both clarity and resilience. The apartment, once a theater of tension and suspense, now felt like a sanctuary of reflection, support, and shared strength. In the quiet moments before sleep, I reflected on the journey we had traversed from suspicion and confrontation to transparency, accountability, and emotional restoration. Lila beside me, her presence calm and unguarded, embodied both the vulnerability and courage necessary for healing. The journey had been arduous, demanding patience, deliberate engagement, and empathetic understanding, yet it had forged a bond more resilient than before, tempered by the trials we had endured and strengthened by our conscious commitment to navigate complexity together. The days that followed our gradual healing were marked by a cautious sense of normalcy, yet an undercurrent of vigilance remained. Both Lila and I understood that trust, once fractured, does not restore itself fully overnight. It is rebuilt incrementally through deliberate actions, empathetic engagement, and ongoing transparency. Our conversations shifted from clarifying past ambiguities to envisioning the future, establishing routines and rituals that would reinforce honesty, intimacy, and mutual accountability. Each morning, we shared our intentions for the day, openly discussing obligations, potential challenges, and personal concerns. Each evening, we reflected on our interactions, acknowledging moments of success and identifying areas requiring greater mindfulness. I found myself increasingly aware of the subtle dynamics that govern human relationships, the way small gestures can communicate care or mistrust, the significance of consistent honesty, and the importance of shared emotional labor in sustaining relational equilibrium. Lila's presence became a source of comfort rather than apprehension. The shadows of past secrecy gradually dissipated, replaced by a deliberate attentiveness to mutual needs and boundaries. Our home, once a repository of tension, now resonated with warmth, laughter, and a renewed sense of partnership. Despite the progress, a lingering complexity persisted. The man who had initially been the catalyst for confrontation continued to exist in the periphery of our lives, his role now clarified, yet carrying implications for our ongoing interactions. Lila and I discussed boundaries, responsibilities, and the importance of transparency in all future dealings involving him or any external parties. These discussions, while challenging, reinforce the principle that relational resilience is not a static state, but a dynamic process, requiring conscious engagement, ethical reflection, and shared commitment. A week later, an unexpected revelation emerged, an unanticipated twist that underscored the depth of human complexity and the necessity of vigilance, even in moments of apparent stability. Lila discovered a set of communications she had previously overlooked, exchanged between the man and a third party, that revealed additional pressures and manipulations impacting her decisions. The discovery was unsettling, yet it provided clarity, confirming that her choices had been constrained not only by ethical responsibility, but also by external forces operating beyond her control. The twist was a reminder that truth, trust, and relational dynamics are often layered, requiring continuous attention and thoughtful navigation. We addressed this revelation with deliberate care. Together, we reviewed the communications, analyzed their implications, and discussed strategies to mitigate potential consequences. The process was collaborative, reflecting the evolved dynamics of our relationship, one in which transparency, empathy, and shared decision-making formed the foundation of action. Lila's composure and willingness to confront the new information with honesty and reflection reinforced my confidence in her integrity, while also underscoring the ongoing nature of relational vigilance and ethical consideration. The emotional landscape, while still complex, had shifted from one of suspicion and fear to one of proactive engagement and mutual support. We learned to recognize triggers, anticipate potential sources of conflict, and address uncertainties before they could escalate. Daily interactions became opportunities for reaffirmation of trust, empathy, and shared values. Minor disagreements, once fraught with tension, were now approached as collaborative problem-solving exercises, emphasizing understanding rather than accusation. This evolution in communication marked a significant milestone in our journey, reflecting not only healing but also the development of emotional intelligence and relational maturity. In parallel, I focused on my own emotional growth. Weeks of suspicion, confrontation, and gradual understanding had left residual tension, requiring active management. I engaged in reflective practices, journaling insights, tracking emotional responses, and analyzing triggers. These practices enabled me to approach interactions with Lila from a place of measured empathy, minimizing reactive behavior, and reinforcing the integrity of our reconstructed trust. By acknowledging and processing my own emotional landscape, I strengthened my capacity to participate constructively in the ongoing dynamics of our relationship. As we settled into a new rhythm, we began to explore the possibility of shared projects and future planning. Conversations that once might have been avoided due to latent tension were now approached with openness, deliberation, and mutual respect. We discussed goals, both personal and relational, collaboratively establishing priorities, timelines, and strategies. The act of shared planning served as a reinforcement of trust, demonstrating that commitment, transparency, and accountability could coexist with ambition and forward momentum. A subtle but profound shift occurred in our emotional connection. Lila's gestures, once guarded, became increasingly expressive and natural. Moments of humor, shared joy, and affectionate acknowledgement of mutual effort became frequent, reinforcing the emotional bond that had been tested so severely. I noticed the resilience inherent in her character, the capacity to navigate complex pressures, maintain ethical integrity, and engage authentically despite prior secrecy and external constraints. This recognition deepened my admiration and empathy, reinforcing the foundation of a partnership capable of enduring future challenges. By the end of the second week of restored equilibrium, the trajectory of our relationship had transformed significantly. The turbulence of secrecy, confrontation, and ethical complexity had given way to a proactive, collaborative, and emotionally resilient dynamic. While vigilance remained necessary, it was now balanced with trust, understanding, and the conscious cultivation of intimacy. The apartment, once a space of tension and anxiety, now felt like a refuge, a place where reflection, mutual support, and authentic emotional connection could flourish. Finally, in a quiet moment one evening, Lila and I sat together on the balcony, rain having passed, city lights twinkling like distant stars. The conversation turned to reflection on the journey we had undertaken, the trials, revelations, confrontations, and incremental healing. We acknowledged the profound challenges we had navigated and the lessons learned about trust, accountability, and ethical responsibility. In that reflective space, there was not only closure for past events, but also an anticipation of a future informed by understanding, empathy, and deliberate relational engagement. We realized that the ultimate resolution was not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of informed trust, mutual accountability, and the capacity to navigate complexity together. Each challenge we faced had reinforced the principles of transparency, communication, and emotional resilience. The twists, surprises, and confrontations had been catalysts for growth, fostering a depth of understanding and intimacy that might not have been possible in the absence of adversity. In those quiet moments, I recognized a profound truth. Relationships are living, dynamic entities, shaped by choices, actions, and ethical engagement. Trust, once fractured, requires deliberate reconstruction through transparency, empathy, and shared responsibility. Forgiveness is not a single act, but a continuum nurtured through repeated acknowledgement, reflection, and authentic engagement. Lila and I had traversed the full spectrum of relational challenge, from suspicion and betrayal to transparency, confrontation, and finally, mutual understanding. As we turned back into the apartment, hand in hand, the city's nocturnal hum, a gentle backdrop, there was a sense of completion, not finality, but a milestone marking the transition from turmoil to resilience. We had faced uncertainty, ethical complexity, and emotional turbulence, and emerged with a relational framework grounded in clarity, empathy, and accountability. The journey was ongoing, yet the foundation for enduring connection, informed by experience and reinforced by deliberate effort, had been firmly established. Life often tests us in ways we cannot anticipate, revealing truths we might wish to ignore and challenging the foundations of trust, love, and integrity. This story shows that even in moments of betrayal, secrecy, and uncertainty, courage, transparency, and empathy can guide us toward understanding and healing. True strength lies not in avoiding mistakes or pain, but in facing them with honesty, compassion, and a willingness to learn. Relationships, like life itself, require patience, deliberate effort, and the bravery to confront discomfort while nurturing trust. Every challenge offers an opportunity to grow, to forgive, and to deepen our connections with those we love. What matters most is the choice to act with integrity, to communicate openly, and to embrace the lessons hidden within hardship. When we do, even the deepest wounds can transform into bridges of resilience and empathy, leading us to a future richer in understanding and emotional strength. If this story moved you or inspired reflection, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of drama, life lessons, and emotional journeys.